We thank you for joining us today for our 4th application support seminar. We're very excited to have y'all here and excited to bring you resources that are going to help support your financial plan and your budget designs as you draft your charter school proposals. Remember that those proposals are due December 7th by 5 p.m. Central Time. And now for some introductions. Today we have with us David Marks, Director of Financial Compliance Division. David, would you like to say a few words, please?
Sure. I'm David Marks, the Director of Financial Compliance. Just a quick overview of what my division does. We do student attendance audits. We review all of the annual financial reports that school districts and charter schools submit. And all of you that are on this call, if you're awarded a charter, will be required to submit one of those reports to us. I have a team that digs through there and looks through them. We also issue first ratings, so the financial accountability ratings that you will all, if you're awarded a charter, would receive. We do other financial management reviews, special allotment reviews, and SHARs and state comp ed. So kind of a big swath of what we look at, and mainly our focus is on the spending side of your state and local funds, whereas my counterpart on state funding is on the side of generating those funds. So a little bit about my team.
Thank you. Appreciate that. We also have with us today Melissa Giesberg, who is with the Charter School Division, and she works with the CSP grant. She's having some technical issues, so she's having difficulty with her camera, so she's off camera right now. Our director, Marion Shuddy, will be joining us shortly, and we'll let her say a few words then. We also have members of our new schools team, John Garland and Natalie Elliott. Would each of you like to say a few words, please?
Hey, everybody. Good to see some familiar faces, and just thanks for joining our 4th seminar. I was talking to Drew earlier and just saying how these have really been a success, and I'm glad we're doing them this year. So.
Yeah, agreed. Welcome, everyone. We've got great attendance today, and that's what we were hoping to see. This is such a crucial topic for success with your charter school proposals. So welcome, and hope it's informative for you.
Thank you, John and Natalie. And I'm Drew Ann Wise. I'm the new schools team manager, and I'm really happy that you could all join us today. So taking a look at the agenda, we will start with a presentation by David, followed by a short Q&A, and then Marion will present on the CSP grant, followed by another Q&A period. But before we get started, let's do a little housekeeping. If you have any questions, we're asking that you please place them in the Q&A function for archival purposes. And then we're going to try to address them during the Q&A periods and post all of them in the FAQ document on the information sessions webpage. Secondly, we are recording today's session, and we are going to be posting that on the additional supports webpage along with the presentations probably next week. So without further ado, we're going to get started. David, would you take it away?
Sure. And we have one question. So before I go to share my screen, I want to just make sure and address that question. They wanted to know who my counterpart is. So my equal on the state funding side is Amy Copeland.
Great. Thank you.
All right, let's see here. All right, maybe one of y'all have to share. It's not letting me share my screen. So if one of you want to.
Yep, let me fix that for you, David.
Tee it up.
I think I just fixed it. So sorry about that. Try it now.
There we go. All right. So, like I said, I'm David Marks, Director of Financial Compliance. I've had the privilege of getting to be a part of these the application interviews since We've changed over to the agency doing the interview, so I guess probably 7 or 8 years. Drew and John, y'all have kind of been around since the beginning also. And so I've seen a lot of really well-written charter applications, and I've seen some that still need some work, and some that have had some difficulties getting the information in. And so today, my perspective is going to be from as a reviewer of those applications, specifically from the finance side, just kind of talking about what those the things that I see in the financial portions. And then not only that, I do go through the other sections and look at the other sections, and I'll talk about trying to make sure that it all included and it all agrees with one another. So first, on the finance areas, community engagement and student recruitment, I do focus on that because I want to see what kind of how much engagement that you'll have with the community, and what the community desires are, and then the student recruitment, what you plan on doing to get students in the door, and how you plan on serving those students. One piece of that that's important is the ADA, and that's how you're going to be state funded. And so really focusing in on what those students look like, what kind of additional services they may need, those types of things. And so those are important pieces to the application because those do drive additional funding. And then of course, facilities, we want to know if you're planning on buying, if you're planning on renting, if you're going to do remodels, where those facilities are going to be located. All of those things are items that I'm interested in, because that can drive and help support the success of your charter school. And so those are another piece that I look at. School schedule and transportation services. First, on the school schedule side, you're all required to operate for 75,600 minutes. And so we'll be looking at your schedule to see that you are offering it at a minimum 75,600 minutes. That's the equivalent of 180 days and going for 7 hours. So if you wanted the most traditional school schedule that you can have, that's what it would be, 180 days, 7 hours a day. But you can do many other ways, and a lot of charters, in fact, offer additional minutes. And so some of them have 81,000 minutes. And then on the transportation side, if you've seen my interviews before, sometimes I will touch on the transportation side, because I think that being able to provide transportation to students and getting them to school through some form of transportation is important, and helps with the success of your charter. But it also comes with some difficulties, because transportation is expensive. And so getting creative of being able to transport students to their campuses is important. And charters have worked and figured out ways and set up carpool and services and things like that. And so really thinking about your transportation and how you plan on getting kids to school is something important. And one example that comes to mind, this is from a charter a few years ago. I'll try not to share any names on here. They had a wide range of the number of districts that they were going to serve. And they put in their application that they were going to provide transportation services. However, once we get to the back of the report, into the financial workbook and the budget narrative, they didn't budget for any form of transportation services. So, that raised some concern, because if you have a very wide and your swath of districts that you're planning on serving, that means some of your parents may be having to drive out farther unless you're centrally located, and it'll be convenient for them. So just things to think about as you're you're planning your charter, which I'm sure most of you have already thought about, especially if you're on this phone call. And then in your startup year, we focus on that a lot on the funding side. So what funds are you going to have coming in? Are you going to have local funds? Are you going to have donations? Are you going to take out a loan? Or are you just going to be dependent on the Chart Up School grant? So there's a lot of options for you to think about whenever you're looking at your startup plan. And then the financial plan, of course, is where I spend most of my time, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. All right, so the other areas that impact finance. This slide pretty much has everything else included on your application. So like I said, I spend most of my time in the finance areas, but I do go through each of these other sections, looking for areas where maybe you've talked about spending other funds. And if you talk about spending other funds, then I'll want to see that you have those things included in your financial workbook. So if in your if you're planning for some kind of software purchase and lease in high quality instructional materials instruction, and you've given a long narrative, you've explained it really well, and in there you've assigned a cost to it, then I'll be looking for that cost in the budget workbook, so that we're matching it up and we're making sure that all of these great things that you're going to offer your students is accounted for in the budget. Because if you're granted a charter and you open and you fail to include some of these things in your budget, and you take your budget and that's what you're going to work off of, then you're already going to have some gaps, and you're going to be struggling to operate because you've got some budget gaps there that you're already going to have to make up. And so each of these items I'll look through just to see if there's any funding things, or you've talked about some types of programs that you're going to purchase, then I'll be looking for those things in the budget book. All right, so now we get to the two main pieces, F2, the budget narrative. In the blue box, I highlighted that because I think it's important for you guys to understand. And so in the budget narrative, you want to describe your assumptions behind the projections for the revenue, staffing levels, and costs that are in your workbook. And then the second paragraph provides the amount of funding that you may receive if you're granted the CSP grant. And so, of course, if you're not awarded that grant, then we would be looking for and wanting to hear alternative ways that you plan on supporting your startup of your charter school. And then one other piece on the CSP grant, remember it is a grant, so you have to have the money up front and the costs up front, and then it's a reimbursement. So most traditional federal funds, you spend money you use your own cash up front, and then you get reimbursed from the federal grant. And so that's something to keep in mind as you're going through this. And then on the right hand side, just some key points. You need to support the assumptions made in the revenue and costs. So we want to see some detail of it. You can't just say, I plan on having $500,000 in donations and just leave it at that. We want to see some specifics on that. In particular, if you're saying donations, then of course you've got to include those letters of support to us. Next bullet, explain the financial plans of the charter. So just kind of what I touched on earlier, you're talking about buying this really great literacy program. We'll want to see that in the budget narrative as well, and then how that impacts your financial statements in all of the operation years that you're showing. So startup plus the 5 financial years. The third bullet. So the point of what I'm trying to make is your budget, the budget workbook has a lot of numbers in it, but it doesn't necessarily provide an explanation for all of the items that you put in there. And so we're wanting to see that budget narrative tied closely to the workbook and to help provide some of that additional explanations that maybe you didn't put off to the side that you think are important that you want to share. And so we're looking for that type of thing. And then that final bullet down there, and you're going to hear me say it again, the workbook and the narrative should align. So if you say that you're going to have $500,000 in donations in the budget narrative, well, then I will be going through your workbook looking for that $500,000 in donations. So you need to go through, once you get your workbook developed, or if you do your budget narrative first, you need to make sure that both of those things have the same dollar amounts in there, and they're working in tandem to explain one another. And then on the financial plan workbook, the top bullet, the assumptions in the workbook must match the budget narrative. So just like I pointed out, if you write something in your budget narrative, then we want to see it in the workbook. And there you have lines to provide an explanation, and we're looking for what did you put in those lines to support to support the numbers that you're putting in your workbook. Assumptions match other areas in the application. So I kind of talked about if you're buying that literacy program, we want to make sure that if you've included it in your high quality instruction materials, then it's included in the budget narrative, and then it's also included in the workbook, so that you show that you've accounted for those that cost somewhere. Provide for an explanation for each of the assumptions made on the startup and assumptions tab. That's just as it sounds. There has been times, I could think one year, a few years ago, there were, I think 2 or 3 charters who, for whatever reason, wasn't entering information in the explanations tab of the budget workbook. For me, that's a big concern, because that's part of the information that is driving the assumptions, driving your costs, and it's showing us what you're thinking about. And so that's something that we're interested in, and we want to see those assumptions and what you're doing to think about how you're going to work your budget within your charter. And then on the enrollment tab, another thing that we want you to think about is we want you to clearly identify the student populations that are being served. So you may want to look at the surrounding districts and maybe even other charters that are close to you, and look at their student populations and the types of students that they're serving. Like I said, each of those will come with additional funding. So special education has its different weights. And then if you plan on mainstreaming, then there's a mainstream weight. Compensatory education, that also comes with different weights. And then just as a side note, if you're not that familiar with compensatory education, those students who are driving the funding for comp ed are your students who are economically disadvantaged and who would qualify for free and reduced lunch. So that's something that you want to serve. And so I've seen in the past where districts say they're going to serve 80% economically disadvantaged status students. However, they didn't include the compensatory education funding in there. And so and that can be quite a bit of funds. So it's something that you want to think about whenever you're going through that enrollment tab of the types of students, populations that you're going to serve. The one caveat I'll say though is that with each of those buckets, they do have spending requirements. So if you generate special education funds, then 55% of your special education funds have to be spent directly on the program. That means the other 45% can be treated as indirect costs and used to pay for overhead and things like that. So something to keep in mind as you're working through your budgets. And then my final things for you to think about when you're making assumptions, and we want you to use a reasonable basis. So when I think about this, I think about on the budget workbook where you're putting in the percentages and then the explanations on the far column of what it is, why it's growing or increasing those costs or those revenues. Then we'll want to be able to see your explanation of, well, why are they increasing? And so what I'm suggesting is think about what is going to drive those costs. Some cases it's going to be the number of students. In other cases, it could be teachers. And then for building maintenance, it may be just the square footage of the building. And you may be using all three of those or other things to show increases in cost. So something to think about whenever you're providing those explanations and coming up with a reasonable basis for an increase in cost or a decrease in cost is one of those items. Another item that sometimes is forgotten, folks will say that they're going to use a loan to help get them started. However, if I see a loan in the application, then I will immediately start looking for the subsequent payments. There's no loans that are free, so the expectation is that you're going to have to start paying them back. And if you do use a loan, make sure and include what types of repayment plans you think that you're going to get. So if it's going to be a 5-year payback or a 10-year payback, and then whatever the interest rate is that you think that you would get, make sure and include those items as well. And then the third one, some costs will increase as the students and staff increase. Other costs increase at a different rate. So I kind of touched on it with my first bullet over to the left. In this case, your audit and your legal costs probably won't increase at the same rate as your student and staff increases. So there may be another increase in there that you want to think about and plan for. Your insurance costs may not increase as fast as the student body increases. So just something to think about as you're working through those final costs and expenses and trying to derive your budget. And then this last bullet point, I will say, I noticed this in the beginning years a lot more than what I have these past few years. Your revenues must exceed or equal expenses. If you're showing a loss for years, that's going to take some additional explanation on your part on coming up with how are you going to offset those losses, especially in the early years when maybe you don't have much funds saved up. There's an expectation that you're going to have to cut expenses, and I think part of the application walks you through that. But you'll save yourself a lot of work on the front end if, when you're working your budgets each year, you make sure that at least your revenues equal your expenses. And then the last little point is, if not, then what needs to be corrected. So I'm telling you that you need to go through and make your revenues equal your expenses and figure out a way to do that, or you'll end up having to take out a loan. And so then that'll have the payback, and we'll want to see that. Not saying you can't do that, but it's just things to think about. I look forward to meeting each of you during the interviews, and good luck.
Thank you, David, very much. Appreciate that. There are several questions we have time for. Do you see them? Do you,
Yeah, I'm looking at them.
okay.
Says you want to answer them all. Do you want?
No, that's just the way to say we're going to answer it live.
Okay.
I don't want to answer any of them. Thank you.
All right. Unless alternative schedule for dropout prevention, half the minutes, right? So if you have an alternative schedule for dropout prevention and you've been approved for that, then yeah, your minutes would be different than the 75,600. When I reference 75,600 minutes, I'm referencing the most traditional charters. Can you address school reimbursements for students taking public transportation to get to school? There is some transportation. I don't remember how much the reimbursement is. I apologize for that. But there is reimbursement for students using the bus passes to get to school. So that is something that a few charters in the past have talked about. The one thing I would caution you on is that you'll want to think about the ages of your students if they're taking public transportation and if they're going to have chaperones with them or not. But yes, that is a true statement. There is some reimbursement from the state for kids taking public transportation. Let's see. Do you know the time frame for when the schools would receive the CSP grant? I'm going to wait for Marion to answer those questions. She will be answering the CSP grant questions. What about weights for gifted and talented? If you're a charter and you're offering the gifted and talented program, the weight is 0.07 times the basic allotment up to 5% of your enrollment. So that's the weight for gifted and talented. All right, so for expenses that might be tied to funding outside the scope of the workbook, teacher salaries, TIA or facility spending, and NIFA, should we budget assuming we don't receive the funding for those? So it's a little bit difficult. Some of those are difficult to budget for. So I would probably be more conservative on budgeting for those because they each come with some specific requirements. Hold on real quick. All right. Can you share what federal sources are allowable for the financial workbook? So Title I funds, if depending on your student population, National School Lunch Program, those are allowable if you want to include those. Remember those are on a reimbursement. And so it'll be the charter having the cash flow to be able to spend the funds, and then the reimbursement comes from the federal programs. And I wouldn't, if I were writing my application, I wouldn't necessarily go in too much detail on the federal funds, but they are and will be a big part of your charter if you're awarded one. And so I feel like it's more conservative to not include the federal funds than it is to include them and not have them accounted correctly. Sometimes when I place an explanation in the budget assumptions area, they come out looking like hashtags. When I go past a certain amount of text, do I know why this is happening? I don't know why that's happening, but I will pass it on to my team and see if they can figure that out. And I'll get back with Natalie and Drew and John to see if we can provide an explanation.
I think that this is a good stopping point, and I know there's another question for John, and if we have time, we'll answer it in the end of the session, but we're going to move on now. Thank you, David, so much for presenting and answering these questions. We have Marion with us now, and she's going to introduce herself, and then she's going to present on the CSP grant.
Thanks, Joanne, and thanks to David for joining us this afternoon. Hi, everyone. I'm Marion Shetty. I'm the director of the Charter School Division here at TEA. You've seen me probably on our mandatory info session webinars and our other webinars that we've done. So I'm here today to talk about the CSP, or the Charter School Program Startup Grant Allowable Cost. So really excited to dive in through this. It's going to be a lot of kind of some bare bones basics of information as we go through this. So you'll want to refer back to these slides as you're building out your budgets and thinking about what you would want to use the CSP dollars for. But we wanted to make sure that everybody had a good kind of grounding of kind of frame of reference to use. So let's go ahead and kind of dive into the slides. So first and foremost, your startup grant contacts. You have myself as the director on our team. We also have Melissa Giesberg as well. And then our folks in the grants team who, if you are approved, you'll get to know and love our Paul Michaels and Eleanor Blaze. And so we work with them to help process the grants. There are grant contacts kind of in our Division of Grants Administration. So let's dive right in. So first and foremost, the CSP grant gives us it has funds that have been awarded to TEA in order for us to then redistribute as subgrants to charter schools that are new or are replicating successful models. And so these funds have really specific narrow purpose, which they can be used for. Ultimately, the U.S. Department of Education drives what we can expend as, or what, our subgrantees can use as allowable cost. And so we don't make a lot of these determinations. The U.S. Department of Education does make a lot of those determinations. And so that's where all of kind of the regulations and guidance around what can and can't be used comes from. So just want to kind of put that out. And that's something that is common across all states that have the Charter School Program grant. So when we talk about allowable costs, the costs that are associated with the CSP grant must kind of meet this minimum threshold of necessary. So is the item needed for the startup of the charter school? Is it reasonable? So would a reasonable person spend that amount of money on that item? Would it stand up to kind of public scrutiny? And then lastly, is it allocable? So is it being incurred specifically for the startup? And is the cost proportional to the benefit provided? Basically, this is kind of what I think of as kind of a common sense test, right? So, and is it necessary for your startup, right? These are startup grants. That's what these funds are used for. Is it a reasonable cost? So we want to be good stewards of all dollars, both state and federal dollars. So does it make sense to pay this amount of money for the item? And is it allowable? So is it being incurred specifically for the startup? So there's two kinds of costs. And we, in the section in the application, you'll see this table. We've pulled this directly from the application. So your budgeted expenditures have to be tied to the type of activity, regardless of when that expenditure occurs. So there's two types of activities. There's planning, which is related to kind of the startup of the school. And then there's implementation, which are kind of related to the actual kind of running of the school towards the beginning. So we'll dive into what are different types of allowable uses of funds for both types of activities, both planning and implementation. So allowable costs for planning activities, we'll start there. So these are funds, these are costs that are connected to the planning and design of the charter school's educational program, the professional development and training for teachers and staff, and for special education support as well. So allowable costs for implementation activities are one-time kind of startup equipment purchases necessary to implement a charter school. And so this can include, but is not necessarily limited to, right, furniture for the school, desks, chairs, computers, equipment related to technology, physical education and art, and even playground equipment. There's also, non-consumable supplies and materials for startup activities are also allowable. So this means textbooks, library books, reading materials, teaching materials. Think about all the things that you need to kind of buy in order to start a school, that you need to have in that school ready for day one. What it does not include is consumable materials, like let's say a student workbook. So let's say textbooks, they stay in the classroom, or maybe you send students home with those, right? You're going to have those over. These are not, these are kind of like a one-time cost. Where recurring costs, like a workbook that you would need to buy every year for students, those are not allowable. So also allowable are costs associated with the installation of the following. So computers, data systems, networks, and telephone systems. Also that are allowable costs are one-time startup costs associated with providing transportations to students, excuse me. So sometimes maybe you want to purchase a bus, actually, or these are kind of one-time costs that would be associated with it. For implementation activities, you have also rental and occupancy costs for the school facility up to the first 30 days of the initial implementation phase. And then costs associated with carrying out necessary renovations and minor facilities repairs. And so these types of budgeted expenditures sometimes may require U.S. Department of Education approval. So if we see these, we'll often flag these. We'll make sure that we get approval from the U.S. Department of Education, and we'll make sure that they deem that these are allowable costs, so that that they're necessary and reasonable and allocable. So some examples of minor facility repairs may include, like repairing a leak in the roof, replacing a broken window, repairing a furnace or an air conditioning unit. Kind of in essence, these are all like minor repairs that neither add to the permanent value of the property nor, kind of prolong its intended life, but rather kind of keep this stuff in an operating condition. And this is really mean to make sure that, are there a couple of small tweaks that the facility might need in order for you to be able to open your school in that location. So our next section, our allowable costs for implementation activities are financial management software and training, property insurance to cover equipment purchased with grant funds, and other appropriate or non-sustained costs that cannot be supported from other sources. So we want to make sure, that that folks have the right financial management software and training, and that any equipment that you're purchasing, that you have the insurance to go with that. And then lastly, let's talk about this one, which is payroll, because this one, it comes up all the time. So teacher, school leader, and instructional support personnel salaries are allowed, but there are some severe caveats to this. So they're limited during the planning phase. So if you're in the planning period, and so kind of in that year zero, and then up to the first 30 days of the initial implementation phase. So the expenses must be associated with planning activities or implementation activities, as opposed to kind of ongoing operations. So this is really important that, if you're paying a salary for somebody during the planning period, right, they're working on planning activities and opening of the school, and not necessarily kind of ongoing operations of the school. Specialized instructional support personnel can be charter campus based, or could be kind of new charter management organization staff dedicated to providing instructional supports. So there's some flexibility there. And then really kind of there's also, you can use that to support professional development of teachers and staff who are going to work in the charter school campus that occur by the 30th day of operation. So if you want to bring in teachers, school leaders for professional development before the school year begins, you can use this to pay those costs as well too. And then some initial implementation activities that kind of you see listed here include, right, informing the community about the campus, so kind of recruitment activities, folks bringing in to kind of acquire necessary equipment and educational materials and supplies, acquiring or developing curriculum materials, and then teacher and staff recruiting, right? So these are all activities that are kind of connected to one-time things that have to happen for the school to open. So let's go into what is not allowed. You know, we break into our heavy red font here. So we want to make sure anything on these slides, we know from the USDOE is not allowed to be used with the CSP dollars. So field trips are not allowed. Hosting or sponsoring of any conferences or advisory councils, cost of membership in any civic or community organization, salaries or personnel or contracted personnel beyond those first 30 days of the initial implementation phase of the school. And that initial implementation phase starts the day that the school begins to serve students. Any kind of debt service payment or like a lease purchase, as well as promotional items. So what's also not allowed is rental or occupancy costs for the school facility beyond the first 30 days of the initial implementation phase. And here we go. I know this question came in. What is not allowed? You're not allowed to purchase or lease of land or real estate with the CSP funds. Construction is also not allowed. So you're not allowed to build. Let's say you have the land already, you're not allowed to build a building with CSP funds. Consumable instructional or other supplies and materials. So we already talked about that, right? So no workbooks or things of that nature. You're not allowed to pay for accounting or bookkeeping services, except with the purchasing of accounting software. We also know that your annual audit, you're not allowed to pay for that with the CSP funds. You're not allowed to use any funds for ongoing food service. No, any other kind of property or liability insurance is not allowed. No interest on loans, no deposits of any kind, such as a security or a service deposit. And obviously no religious instruction materials or insignia. And you're not allowed to use this for any extracurricular activities such as UIL or competitions or athletic programs that are not part of the state required PE program. So we've gone over a lot of kind of like what is and isn't allowed. You know, I think you're going to have these slides as you're building out your budget and you're thinking about, well, we could use these dollars for X. Just refer to the slides. There's a lot of kind of detail in here. And then also if you have a question, we're also happy to kind of reach out and think through some questions that you might have as well too. Now, also in the application and the CSP grant as a priority points for related to qualified opportunity zones. So these are something that also that the agency doesn't set. These are census tracts that are nominated by a state and have received a special designation by the IRS. They're used to kind of spur growth in economically distressed communities. And if you locate a campus in these zones, you're entitled to priority points. And so you'll see that in the application. There's also a map that includes search capabilities linked in the application narrative document, where you can see kind of if your campus is located, then you're eligible to receive the priority point. You would need to know where your campus is going to be located in order to receive those points. So now we just kind of walked through a lot of kind of what is, because some do's or don'ts. I think we've got some Q&A questions in here. Can you break up the CSP grant over 3 years? So you have the ability to determine when you want to use those funds. However, you can only use the planning funds for 18 months. So if you're doing planning activities, you only have 18 months to use those funds. If you want to use the implementation funds over a longer period of time, you can do that. We'll work with you on your grant period, and you'll see that in the grants application when you fill that out after you've completed all your contingencies and been awarded a contract. Can you use the CSP funds to rent a building? No, you cannot. That is in our allowable cost slide. You're not allowed to use past the initial 30 days. So you could use it occupancy cost kind of while you're in that planning phase, but past the first 30 days, you can't use it to rent a building anymore. So I think really the best thing to think about is like, are these ongoing costs, right? Is this a cost that I'm going to have over time after time after time? Really, the whole purpose and intent of the grant is to help operators with all of the kind of one-time costs that come with starting a school. So lots of things to like, you know, the furniture to fill the school, initial textbooks, things that happen in the planning phase in that year zero before state funds start flowing to you. For the opportunity zone, if the opportunity zone is in our attendance zone, we have to be physically located in the opportunity zone. I believe it's about campus location. So it's and that's dictated by our CSP application as well. There we go. If we don't use all of the classrooms in our building in year one, are we allowed to use CSP funds on only the classrooms that are used in that year or all the classrooms? You can choose how you want to use those funds in your building. So if you're buying, you know, let's say you're going to have students in year two in those classrooms and you need furniture for those, you're able to buy those. It's not tied to year one of operation only. There is a time period for the grant, and you want to make sure that you're being thoughtful about using those funds related to the grant. We'll be able to look into that. Does putting up a dividing wall to turn one classroom into two count as construction? So that's gonna count as a facilities modification that could potentially add value to the facility by adding additional classrooms. I think we'll have to talk a little bit more about kind of the specifics related to that facility. And there was a chat that came into the Q&A. Can you purchase a building with CSP funds? No, you cannot.
Marion, there was another one previously. Can you talk about when approved schools would be able to access the CSP funds?
Sure, thank you, Joanne. So in order to access the CSP funds, so everyone who goes through our application process and is recommended for approval and is approved by the State Board of Education is eligible to receive the CSP grant, as long as they meet the federal definition of a charter school, which through our process, everyone should. We are working after the SBOE takes action or doesn't take action on applications. Our team works to address any contingencies that are needed in the application process. You have 2 months to clear those contingencies, but the sooner you clear those contingencies, the sooner that you're eligible to receive a contract, receive a charter, a number that we assign to you, and then that our grants team uses that. So we are working to get those funds out as soon as possible to everyone. The SBOE will decide in June, meaning that we'll get those contingencies out to everyone hopefully in that month, and then be folks kind of depending on that potentially have access to those CSP funds as early as September 1, which is our the earliest that we can award them with our grant date. Excuse me, October 1, sorry, not September 1.
Okay.
So you could have, so in theory, access to the CSP grant funds almost a year before you open, which is something that we're really excited about and why we've put the CSP components in the generation, the 26 and now the 27 applications.
Do you see a couple of those other two?
Yeah, I see. Okay, to qualify for the extra points, you have to have a lease agreement for a location in the opportunity zone. John, you wanna address that?
Yeah, so at the time of submission, you do not have to have a lease agreement. No, not in place, not at all.
And then for clarity, health insurance for the startup year is unallowable. So salaries and benefits are allowable for the planning year, but those activities have to be dedicated to planning activities. So whoever you're paying that salary and benefits for would need to be involved in planning activities and not just the ongoing operations of the school.
I just want to come off mute and quickly say, I see a hand raised. I'm not sure if that's an accident or not, but we do want to be using the Q&A function and we have time to address all the questions. So please make sure you're putting your questions in the Q&A function if you have any remaining.
I also wanted to add that we are getting ready to post the FAQ from our info sessions. It's been a huge project and we expect it to post later this week. There are a lot of these questions are answered in the FAQ and there's additional questions on the CSP, but we are going to place the questions and answers from today's seminar also at the end of that FAQ document. So John will be sending out an email as soon as it posts so that you will all know. Do you see that question about the F-rated school?
Yes, I believe Marion addressed it.
So these recordings can be found on the Additional Supports webpage. They'll usually post probably by the end of the week. And if you click on the date, today's date, it'll take you to the recording and the presentations.
Aaron, oh yeah, you got it.
Yeah, there's a question coming in here around David's present a contingency plan in our application for not receiving any CSP funding or partial both. So if you are awarded, if you're recommended for approval and awarded a contract or awarded a charter school, you will receive the CSP funding. So there's no need to put a contingency plan in there. And the maximum award is the $900,000. So we recommend that everyone put the $900,000. This is basically, if you get approved, you're getting $900,000 of CSP grant, right? Which is something that's really exciting. This is the maximum award that we're allowed to give you under the federal guidance. And so, no longer have to compete for this grant. In the past, we made all of our applicants who were approved compete again for those funds, and we no longer have to do that. We've put it through the application process. So if you are recommended for approval and SBOE does not veto, then you will receive the CSP funding. Clarify one more time, are we able to rent a building using CSP funds, but just until the first 30 days? That's correct. So rental or occupancy costs beyond those first 30 days of the initial implementation phase are not allowed. So before that, they are allowed. But you cannot buy the facility. You can't construct a facility. Most federal grants, these are non-construction grants. They did make that one small tweak related to kind of the facility repairs really as kind of an idea of like a one-time cost to make sure that you could be able to use a building for a school, and not necessarily building improvements like adding walls.
So I see a question saying that someone's trying to click on the previous sessions and the slides videos aren't there. We'll double check that. They should be there, but we'll double check. And if there is some sort of technical issue going on, we'll get that fixed.
Yeah. Yes, thanks, Sherry. So the videos are on our TEA YouTube page, but and that's where they're hosted. And then we put the links on our website, but we'll make sure that they're, we'll double check on everything there for y'all.
Does somebody want to touch base on the contingency funding? Whether we need to have 90 days worth of expenses? We can get back with you on that answer.
90 days cash on hand is best practice for operations. However, I'm not sure that we have a specific amount recommended for the financial plan workbook, but obviously we can ask David for clarification on that.
Yeah, and I also think one other good place to kind of reference is the standards of which you'll be evaluated too once you open a school through our Charter First ratings. And so it's always good to kind of take a look at those and see what financial plans and kind of that you would put in place so that you would be able to have a passing Charter First rating as well too.
So Marion, I think we're at time.
All right.
Thank you all so much for joining. Just as a reminder, we do not have office hours this week. Those will commence next week. We will try our best to go ahead and get questions that were presented here with some responses uploaded for your review as well. But again, thank you so much. We've just gotten some really great experiences and feedback from these seminars. So we just thank you all for coming, and we will see you all next week.
Thank
Thanks,
you, everyone.
everybody. Great to see everyone.
Bye.